Help keep Kinks and Beats Daily ad-free and receive bonus content early with a contribution of 20 cents per episode. Visit herohabit.com/shop for more information. Hello. Welcome to Kinks and Beats Daily. I'm your host, Tony Fry. This is episode 161. I thank you for downloading yet again. If you're new to the podcast, you've got 160 other episodes to get through. And thank you for downloading. And if you're a regular member, thanks for sticking with us. We got a long way to go still. Today we're talking about isolation, and this is actually kind of a topical episode in a way, and we'll get to that later. Songs by John Lennon. It was released December 11th, 1970 on his album Plastic Ono Band, and we've talked about this previously. This is the album he did right after the Beatles, his first album proper with, music. And it's a very stripped back, unproduced record. And he was going through some primal scream therapy. He was coming off of a heroin addiction. So he was very raw. He was addressing his feelings. So his vocals are very raw and focus a lot on the screaming. And which, I mean, John's got one of the best rock and roll screams ever. So it suits that. But the instrumentation is usually just three dudes. For the most part, it's John, Klaus Voormann on bass, Ringo on drums. And then for one or two tunes, Billy Preston comes in on organ or piano, and Phil Spector plays piano on one tune, I think. So for the most part, this is just a trio. And there are some overdubs and stuff, but this is a very, very stark difference to pretty much everything John would release after this album. Beyond this, he's just releasing standard rock albums. But this one is very, I want to say naked and bare, and it's a tough listen sometimes, but it's worth it. The music's really good, and the emotion is really good. And there's a great documentary from the Classic Albums series about this that is worth watching if you can track it down. So anyway, this track was recorded October 6th, 1970. John's on vocals, piano, and organ. And like I said, Ringo on drums, Klaus Voormann on bass. And the chord progression is nice, but it's not terribly unique. He opens on a D chord. Let me grab my guitar. Opens on a D. And then he raises the fifth a half step. Then he raises it a half step again. Then again. And so when he gets to that last one, now he's playing a D7 chord. So he's playing a D, D augmented, D6, and then a D7. And then to a G chord. And then back. Whoops. And that's basically it. And then he gets to a bridge, and it's just a 1-5-4-5-1-4-4. So he's just going 1-5-4-5-1-5-4. Free the people now. Do. He uses this progression in a song we will be covering in the future. And I didn't realize that it was that progression until I played it in this style. So that's a pretty basic chord progression. And if, I think we've already covered it on this podcast. George Harrison's song, That Is All, uses a very similar progression. You're just raising the top note of the chord a half step at a time and creating this dissonance, but you're also creating... that dissonance is also creating a need for resolution. So it adds a lot of forward momentum to the song. So even though we're just talking about basic chords here, it's the vocals on this that really create the harmonic palette, if you will, because he's pulling a lot of different chord tones out of the vocal part to create dissonance and add to that bluesy sound in the recording. And you'll hear, I'm forgetting the words now, but during that bridge, he'll hit like the minor seventh, and he'll slide into it. So there's almost like a quarter tone movement, which is not an American or a Western thing. That's the Eastern influence he pulled from his time in India and working with Harrison might have influenced that. But that's this like quarter tone movement to barely hit the proper tone just right at the last second, and that adds a lot of dissonance. It adds a lot of tension. It adds a lot of consonance when you actually get to the note. But then it adds to that anxiety that comes with isolation. So, whether he does it intentionally or not, we can debate till the cows come home. But he tends to do this with his vocal deliveries in songs, really make them enhance the meaning of the song. In I'm So Tired, he sounds tired. In Isolation, he sounds anxious and isolated. So it's a cool effect that he does with his voice. There's not a lot of effect on his voice, and there's not a lot going on in the rhythm track, and everything is sparse and exposed, and the lyrics convey his feelings of isolation despite fame and fortune and seemingly endless parade of friends. But among this just very sparse arrangement, Vorman's bass is probably the most frill in the song, and he does some little licks here and there that are just phenomenal. I mean, Klaus Vormann is one of my favorite bass players of all time, and most people don't even know who he is. But he's a phenomenal bass player. He does these little things that really add to the song, kind of between John's vocal lines. And Ringo is rarely more than a metronome during the verses. It's like 1, 2, 3, 4, bass, snare, bass, snare. There's not a lot going on, but there's not a lot that needs to go on. And if you watch that documentary I talked about earlier, they address Ringo's metronome ability on this entire album. He's like that. He does have some fills. He has some cool fills and stuff, but it's mostly Vormann who instrumentally is the most standout performance on this track. This song, hands down, my favorite track on the album. And I like this album quite a bit. It's one of my favorite John Lennon albums. And it's probably the most commercial, even though Love is the song that appears on every greatest hits package that they release every year and a half or so since John's died. Love is always on there. And sometimes Working Class Hero, which came from this album. But I think this is the most commercial track. And if there was going to be a single that could have been a hit, this probably would have been the one. But it wasn't on a single. And anywhere in America or the UK, there is a 45 in the Philippines, though, where this song appears as the B-side to Mother, which was the single around the world. Almost everywhere else in the world, the B-side was a song called Why, which is a Yoko Ono track, which I don't really understand because this is not a Yoko Ono album. Yoko had her own Plastic Ono Band album. She doesn't appear on any of the songs here, like in Double Fantasy where they go every other tune. That's not the case here, so I don't understand why he would give her the B-side. She should have got her own A-side to promote her album, and I'm sure she did, and he should have got the B-side on this. But in the Philippines, on an Apple release, Isolation is the B-side to Mother. And if any of my listeners in the Philippines come across a copy of this in a used record store, let me know, and we'll figure out how to get it to me, because I would like to get my hands on this 45. So the reason this is kind of a topical episode is because this year, just a couple months ago, during the peak of this COVID shelter-in-place thing that we've been going through all over the world, Johnny Depp and Jeff Beck released a cover of this song that was really, really good. It's a little bit more rock, obviously, because it's anchored by Jeff Beck's guitar playing. And so it focuses on the rock aspects of this song more than the sparse and isolated aspects of this song. But it's definitely worth listening to. And if you don't know if Johnny Depp can sing, go check out this video because he does a pretty good rendition of this track. What are your thoughts on Isolation, the song by John Lennon from Plastic Ono Band? Give me a call, 925-494-1739. Email me, kinksandbeats@herohabit.com, or join our new Facebook group, facebook.com/groups/kinksandbeats. And of course, you can find all the information you need about this podcast and all sorts of other stuff if you visit herohabit.com. All right, that's it for me today. Thank you again for downloading. I will talk to you soon. This podcast is presented by the Hero Habit Podcast Network. Swing by herohabit.com today to comment on this episode and poke around our growing database of sports and pop culture news, reviews, and collectibles. herohabit.com. Collect your heroes.